Chapter 6, Lesson 5, Absolute Value Equations. So let's first of all remind ourselves what absolute value is. Absolute value is when you use these symbols here. And what that means is it means how far away the value inside the two lines is from zero. So absolute value is never, ever, ever negative. When you take the absolute value of a number, it's never, because it's always going to be even -3 here. -3 is 3 places away from 0. It's just 3 places to the left instead of 3 places to the right. But it's always going to be 3 or 3, so it's not opposites. That's a frequently confusing thing for some students. So just remember that, because that is a key concept to understand before we get started. So let's talk about this now. So it says here, to solve the absolute value of x is equal to 3. We need to actually have two solutions, because there's two ways of making that. The absolute value of x being equal to -3, there's going to be this one here, 3, and then there's going to be -3. So let that sink in for a second here, because I know we're not used to having x having multiple values that are true. So that's important to understand, that in most absolute value answers, you're actually going to end up with two values for x. So let's look at how we solve these. And the key to understanding this sort of thing is you've got to set up two equations for most of these problems. So for this one right here, we have to rewrite the equation. It's going to be like this. That's the first equation. And then it's also going to be like this. Okay, why that is because if I place that -9 inside the absolute value symbol, if x plus 2 is equal to 9, and then I take the absolute value of it, I'm going to end up with 9. If the x plus 2 is going to be equal to -9, and then I take the absolute value of that, it's still going to be equal to 9. So that's going to still be a true statement. So let's look at this for a second here, and we're just going to solve these the way that we normally do. And for this one here, it's going to be x plus 2 is equal to 9, so it's going to be x is equal to 7. And for this one right here, it's going to be x plus 2 is equal to -9, and so we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. When we do that, we end up with x is equal to -11. So those are the two solutions. And you should always check your work, so plug that in and see if it works. And -11 plus 2 is going to be equal to -9. The absolute value of -9 is equal to 9. And then for this one here, 7 plus 2 is 9. The absolute value of 9 is equal to 9. So that should make sense. So for this one here is actually even easier. It's just x is going to be equal to 0.4. and x is going to also be equal to -0.4. Because when you take the opposite value of either of those two, you're going to end up having 0.4. So let's look at a couple more. So for this one here, think about the absolute value symbols. They're sort of like funky parentheses. You have to get rid of the stuff that's inside before you can proceed with doing other things. So this is x minus 4 is equal to 13. So when we do that, it's going to be x minus 4. We're writing out two different equations now. And x minus 4 is going to be equal to -13. Because remember, when I plug that -13 or that 13, if that's the value of x minus 4, then I'm going to end up with an absolute value of 13. So let's solve these and see that it makes sense here. So x minus 4 is equal to 13. We're going to add 4 to both sides. When we do add 4 to both sides, we're going to end up with x is equal to 17. Because remember, this cancels out because we get the -4 and the +4 part. So for this one here, we're going to add 4 to both sides again. And when we add 4 to both sides, we're going to end up with, this cancels out, the minus 4 and the plus 4, and you're just left with x is equal to negative 9. Once again, you should always check your answers. So plug that back in and see if it works. 17 minus 4, I'm plugging it in here, 17 minus 4 is going to be equal to 13. The absolute value of 13 is 13. And then again, if I plug this in there, negative 9 minus 4 is equal to negative 13, and the absolute value of negative 13 is 13. So that makes sense. So now let's do this one. Again, you need to go ahead and take care of the absolute value part of this first, because that's the only part of the equation. That's like the first thing we would do, like please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, and the order of operations. We get rid of the absolute value part of it before we proceed. So this is going to be 2x minus 1 is equal to negative 7, and 2x minus 1 is equal to positive 7. And again, that hopefully makes sense, because again, all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to the absolute value of this is going to be equal to 7, and if those two are true, then that will be true. So these are two-step equations, so let's do this. Plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, and plus 1. I'm just going to do these like this, and now I get up with 2x, this cancels out, is equal to negative 6. Then here it's going to be 2x, it's going to be equal to 8, because that part cancels out as well. So I'm going to rewrite that over here. 2x is equal to negative 6. So x, divide both sides by 2, you're going to end up with negative 3. And then 2x is equal to 8. X is going to be equal to 4. And again, plug those back into here. 2 times 4 is 8. Minus 1 is going to be 7, so that's true. And then when we plug in negative 3, 2 times negative 3 is going to be negative 6. Negative 6 minus 1 is negative 7, so it's true. So if I have something like this, this is a little bit more complicated, because what I have to do is I have to get rid of this part here and this part here before I can proceed with the absolute value part, because it's on the outside of the absolute value signs, or absolute value symbols. So if you look here, what I'm doing is, first of all, I get rid of the addition or subtraction part. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and that cancels out the 7, and that leads me to that step there. And it's because that cancels out that part here when I add 7, and then I get 11 plus 7 is equal to 18. And then I have to divide both sides by 3. If I divide both sides by 3, I'm going to end up with this here. Absolute value of 4x plus 2 is equal to 6. Then I can solve it. I have to set up the two equations the way I did here. And that's just like we did on the previous page. And 4x plus is equal to 4, and then x is equal to 1, and then 4x is equal to negative 8, and x is equal to negative 2. So the solutions are 1 and negative 2. You check those, and you will see it's correct. So let's do a couple of these to see it makes sense. For this one here, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 7 from both sides. I'm going to choose a different color. When I subtract 7 from both sides, I'm going to end up with 1/2, still an absolute value, symbols, is equal to actually 6, right? Because 13 minus 7 is equal to 6, and then I cancel that out. So now I need to go ahead and get rid of this 1/2. The easiest way of doing that is multiplying everything by 2, because then I'll end up with 1 over 1 on this side. So when I multiply this by 2, I'm going to end up with 3x in absolute value still, minus 6 is equal to 12. Now, I'm going to just skip this part here. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Now I'm going to set my two equations. 3x minus 6 is equal to 12. And 3x minus 6 is equal to negative 12. So now I can just solve these the way I'm used to. Add 6 to both sides for each of them. So I'm going to do this one first. Add 6 to both sides. And when I do that, I end up with 3x is equal to 18. Divide both sides by 3. X is going to be equal to 6. For this one here, I'm going to add 6 to both sides. I end up with 3x is equal to negative 6. And when I go ahead and do that, then I end up with x is equal to negative 2. And when I plug those back in, again, I know it's a little bit of work, but when you plug them back in, you will see that it works because the absolute value is going to be 3 times negative 2, which is going to be negative 6. And then negative 6 minus 6 is going to be negative 12. Negative 12 divided, or times 1/2, that whole expression times 1/2 is going to be, we'll take the absolute value, it's going to be 12, and then it's going to be 12 times 1/2 is going to be 6, and 6 plus 7 is going to be equal to 13. And then up here, same thing. 3 times 6 is 18, minus 6 is going to be, let me see here, minus 6 is going to be 12. Absolute value of 12 is 12, times 1/2 is going to be 6, 6 plus 7 is going to be 13. Let's do one more, this one here. And this one here is a little bit tricky because it's not solvable, and I'll show you why. Because what ends up happening here is you end up with, the first step is going to be 5x minus 4. Remember, you got to keep it that way. That's going to be equal to, bounce the 11 over or subtract 11 from both sides so you can cancel that part out. You end up with negative 3. Now, if you were to proceed, you'd go ahead and you would divide both sides by 5. So you end up with x minus 4 is equal to negative 3 over 5. Now, really important to understand here, this is not possible, because this term here, or this part here, has to be positive. So this is one of those tricky ones that's not solvable. If ever you end up with an absolute value expression that's just by itself on one side and it's equal to an expression on the other side that is negative, it is not a solvable equation. And so this would just be not solvable. Let's try one more up here. So my first step is going to be here. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I end up with 2 absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to 14. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 2 and end up with absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to 7. Now I set up my two equations. I'm just going to write them over here. X minus 1 is equal to 7, and x minus 1 is equal to negative 7. So add 1 to both sides. I end up with x is equal to 8, and x is equal to negative 6. So let's see if that works. If I plug in 8 into this, I end up with 8 minus 1 is going to be 7. 7 times 2 is going to be 14, because it's the absolute value of 7 is times 2 is going to be 14. 14 minus 5 is 9. So now I'm going to try this one here. Negative 6 minus 1 is going to be 7, or it's going to be negative 7. Take the absolute value of that, will give me 7. 2 times 7 is 14, minus 5 is going to be 9. So that's it. Hopefully this makes sense, and good luck.